Hi Cece, welcome to week 10 of your timeline. First up this week is Japan's Heian period, a period of incredible literary achievement. The Heian period takes place from about 794 to 1185. This is the medieval period in Europe, or what some people call the Dark Ages, but all of you know you should never use that term. While those Dark Ages were happening in Europe with all of the plagues and the troubles and the fallen empires, instead in Japan, things were getting, at least for some parts of the population, better and better and better. You know the way that some people now today like to dress up in Renaissance clothing and sort of pretend for a little while that they're living in the Renaissance? Well, during the Heian period, the people of Japan loved to dress up and pretend they were from ancient China. And the Chinese would come over to visit and say, "Why are you all wearing such weird costumery?" That would be like if you guys started wearing powdered wigs and pretended you were from Europe, and then someone from Europe came over and said, "Why are you pretending to be us from hundreds of years ago?" So it was a time of a lot of imagination, a lot of hearkening to the past and focusing on romance. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the most famous piece of literature from this period, which is the tale of Genji, the tale of this romantic knight. He's really a prince born to an emperor who goes on many romantic adventures. If you're wondering about the name Heian, it means peace. It's also the name of the capital city at that time. One more thing to keep in mind about this period is because the society of Japan was so focused on details, intrigue, romances, gossip, the structure of society became very, very rigid, with many, many rules rigidly followed. There were about 30 different social levels to which a person might belong, and each of them had very specific rules, including how many folds were allowed to be in the fan that you used. To create this sign, we're first going to do the motion for Japan. You sort of bring your fingers together, it doesn't have to be up as high as mine is, and draw them apart, and you are creating the shape of the island of Japan, sort of a almost like a banana shape. Japan's, and then for Heian period, we're going to stack the hierarchy, and remember all those rigid levels of society with their folded fans. So Heian period. So altogether, that's Japan's Heian period. Next, we have Charlemagne, crowned emperor of Europe. Now, you sometimes hear him called Charlemagne, and sometimes you might also hear Charles the Great. That's because the French phrase for Charles the Great is Charlemagne. Same guy. This guy had titles upon titles. In 768, he was king of the Franks, and you already know about them. They defeated the Muslims in the Battle of Tours. By 774, just 6 years later, he was king of the Lombards. And by the year 800, again just 6 years later, he is crowned emperor of Rome. So the guy picks up a new kingship every 6 years. I mean, he's great. So I'll tell you the least great thing about him historically is that he converted the Saxons, which on the surface is like, yay, converted the Saxons, unified the culture. By force. They could either convert to Christianity or face mass slaughter. This was no idle threat. Charles ordered entire massacres of the Saxon people. Here are a few fun facts about him. 1, he was crowned in the year 800 on Christmas Day, which I think is kind of fun to remember. 2, his dad was Pepin the Short, which I'm so glad I'm not Pepin the Short, aren't you? And 3, he's named after his grandpa, Charles Martel, who you might remember from leading the victory at the Battle of Tours. Charlemagne conquered so many areas and united so many different parts of Europe that he started a new empire, and we call it the Carolingian Empire, which, believe it or not, comes from Charles. It comes from Karl, which is the German form of Charles. So Carolingian is the Charlingian Empire. His reign is also seen as the start of the Holy Roman Empire. Don't get confused. There's the Roman Empire, there's the Western Roman Empire, there's the Eastern Roman Empire, and then there's the Holy Roman Empire. And they're all slightly different things. Sorry. When we're going through these events really quickly in the timeline, sometimes we can zip over huge, long events and not realize how much space there was between them. So just for some perspective, the fall of the Western Roman Empire that we talked about a few steps ago in the timeline, that was 300 years before the time of Charlemagne. So when Charlemagne comes on the scene and starts doing all of this uniting and conquering and ruling and laying down the law, nobody has seen a king this great, or at least this powerful and good at his job, for 300 years. By the time Charlemagne is done doing his thing, he has united the majority of Western and Central Europe. To create this sign, we're first going to give a C for Charlemagne. It's a bummer because we also have C in Christ, and every sign we do, it's confusing. Thanks for all the C names, history. So we're going to do a C for Charlemagne. For crowned, you'll just pick up your crown, put it on your head, crowned emperor, and then we're going to do the sign for Europe. You make an E, which is your hand is sort of curled over with your fingers touching your thumb. And remember, we often take place names up near the head in ASL. So we're going to take that E and do kind of a circle and tap near the top of our heads. So Europe. Altogether, that's Charlemagne, crowned Emperor of Europe. Next up is Alfred the Great of England. Alfred becomes king in the year 871, and just to give you a little preview about him, he is the only English monarch known as the Great. So what was so great about him? First of all, Alfred spends much of his early reign, actually all of his reign, fighting the Vikings. He often manages to triumph over them, especially in sea battles. But when he can't, Alfred definitely succeeds at compromising with them, making deals, getting agreements. At one point, the Vikings have Alfred's army on the run, and they chase him into the swamp. And at that point, no one is sure if he has survived, if he's going to come out again, if he's going to make another attack. They're like, what's going on with Alfred? While he's in the swamps, an old tale says that he had disguised his appearance so that people didn't know he was king. While he was staying in the hut of a poor peasant woman, she asked him to watch over her cakes to make sure they wouldn't burn. But Alfred was so preoccupied with thinking about his kingdom and all the troubles that were going on that he let the cakes burn. And this peasant woman came back and just yelled at him. That's the whole story. Well, despite these burned cakes, Alfred does make it back out of the swamp with his army. They push the Vikings back, and they besiege the Vikings until Alfred convinces their leader, Guthrum, to convert to Christianity. Conversion by starvation. That's the best kind. The Vikings make an agreement with Alfred to divide the land of England into Saxon territory and the Danelaw. The Danelaw is run by the Vikings, the Danes. And the Saxon territory is broken up into several kingdoms, Mercia, Wessex. This becomes very important later on. Eventually, there's so much fighting going on between the Saxons and the Vikings that there's only one kingdom left, and that's the kingdom of Wessex, Alfred's kingdom. And he stays strong. He uses military tactics like a shield wall. You can see depictions of this in the Bayeux Tapestry, where all these men hold shields so tightly next to each other and on top of each other that they basically form this impenetrable wall, and then they push the wall into the enemy forces. It's intense. Through these dual tactics of compromise, diplomacy, and military victory, Alfred succeeds where many before him had failed. He gets London back from the Vikings and eventually unites many of the Saxon territories, which is why they call him King of the Anglo-Saxons, or England, or England. The other two things that made Alfred great were his emphasis on law and learning. Alfred released an entire law code of his own into English culture, and the whole first half of it was just the 10 Commandments translated into English, and then a whole section of Acts translated into English. By the way, all of these were translated from Jerome's Vulgate, so if you remember that, yay! Vulgate was a really big deal because finally everyone could read the Bible in Latin, but at this point in history, no one can read the whole Bible in English. We're not going to get that for quite some time yet. Alfred's law emphasized fairness and mercy, and this mercy often took the form of allowing someone to pay a fine instead of by having a physical penalty. Almost any crime, except for disloyalty to your lord, could be excused by raising the money, getting people to come around you and support you, and paying the fine, instead of, say, having a limb chopped off or spending years of your life in prison. And from what we can tell, these changes in the law did come from a genuine sense that Alfred wanted to be merciful to his people, as Christ was merciful. And finally, one more thing that made Alfred so great was his emphasis on education and literacy in his reign. From a very young age, Alfred had loved literature. An old story says that Alfred's mother held up a book of Anglo-Saxon poetry, and it was beautiful. And she said, "I'll give this to whichever one of you can memorize it first and recite it back to me." Young Alfred took up the challenge, memorized the book, and he won the prize. Was Alfred the Great the original memory master? But he didn't just stop with childhood poetry books. Throughout his life, Alfred was said to carry a little notebook with him where he wrote down things that happened and things that inspired him and prayers for himself to recite throughout the day, and it was kept beside him continually. He founded schools in the court so that all of his children could be educated, but also so that many people of lesser rank or birth who showed any kind of intellectual promise could also be educated. He also had books translated. The famous Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that chronicles the history of all England was started during Alfred's reign. Alfred would send books to the various abbeys and bishops all around his kingdom. He would send these little jewels on staffs that could be used to point to the words so that the oils of your fingers wouldn't get onto these valuable valuable handwritten texts. There's a jewel on display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford that we think may be one of these little viewing jewels, or astels. It's called the Alfred jewel, and it's beautiful. After his death, Alfred came very close to being declared a saint by the Catholic Church. He's still revered by many. Because of his great leadership and his love for wisdom, many have compared him to Solomon. He was great. To do the sign, we're going to create an A, an ASL A. Sometimes I'm guilty of kind of hiding my thumb or keeping it too tense. Make sure that thumb is right there beside the hand, really clearly visible and not crossing over or hiding. So A, Alfred. For great, we're going to do great. You just sort of raise the roof. Great. The sign for England, I'm a little sad about it. I wish it was something just delightful or whimsical or fun. I wish we could drink tea. But the real ASL sign for England is you take one sort of downward hand like this. You put another hand on top of it, almost like a kind of aggressive handshake, and you give a kind of shake. It's not up and down, but it's kind of a like we've made an alliance, we've made an agreement, but one group is clearly kind of dominating the other group. So altogether, that's Alfred, the Great of England. Next we have Erik the Red and Leif Eriksson, which, if you can't tell from the names, is a father and his son, both of whom were fantastic Norse explorers. There's a bit of a history of violence and exile in the family. They were Vikings, after all. When Erik the Red was 10 years old, his father was banished from Norway for manslaughter. So when he was 10 years old, he and his family made their way to Iceland and settled there. By the way, we call him Erik the Red probably because of the color of his hair and beard. Eventually, Erik ran into similar trouble in Iceland as his father. After killing several people in a conflict over a landslide and the behavior of some servants, Erik was banished from Iceland for 3 years. Fun fact, the group that got together to meet to decide that he should be banished was called The Thing. I love this. So Erik sails away from Iceland, from whence he's been banished, and discovers Greenland. Now, a few people had discovered it before him, other Vikings, other Norsemen. But the first one got there by accident. The second one tried to settle there and failed miserably. Erik was the first successful, permanent settler. And boy, can you tell, because everything there is named after him. He was banished for 3 years. He spent the first winter in a place called Eriksson. He spent the second winter in a place called Eriksholmar. And there are other places there called Eriksfjord. It's a sort of Erik country, Greenland. Now, Erik knew if he wanted his settlement to be really successful, when his 3 years of banishment were up, he had to go back to Iceland and convince people there to come settle in Greenland. So he came up with the name Greenland. Doesn't it sound more inviting and less cold than Iceland? That was his sales pitch, and many people believed him. 25 ships left Iceland to form a settlement in Greenland, and only 14 made it. But those 14 ships were full of permanent settlers. Erik the Red's son, Leif Eriksson, was also an explorer. He's sometimes called Leif the Lucky. Listen to what happened to him. Leif visits Iceland to serve his king for a while. While he's there, he converts to Christianity and decides he wants to go back to Greenland and convert everybody there to Christianity. But on the way, his ship gets blown off course, and he accidentally, luckily, discovers America. Leif Eriksson and his shipmates landed in North America, probably in Canada, and there they found a land where grapes and wheat grew wild. They called it Vinland or Vineland because of all the grapevines everywhere. And to men who had tried to make their way as farmers in Greenland and Iceland, the idea that plants were just sort of growing themselves was fantastic. It seemed like a paradise to them. Keep in mind, this is 500 years before Columbus. Then Leif Eriksson got lucky again on the way back from North America, which he was just lucky enough to discover. They discover a group of shipwrecked sailors and rescue all of them. Then they go back to Greenland and are successful at converting much of it to Christianity. Leif definitely converted his mother, and she commissioned the first Christian church ever to be built in Greenland. The one person Leif couldn't convince was his father, Erik the Red. That man loved his Norse pagan gods. According to most sources, he stayed a pagan for the rest of his life. To create this set of signs, we're first going to do red, so think of red lipstick. maybe since he's kind of a fierce Viking, we're going to give it kind of a harsh drag, Erik the Red. And for Leif Eriksson, who was his baby, we're going to do kind of a baby in a cradle, so we don't forget that those two are related. And for Norse explorers, we're just going to give our traditional explorer sign by looking one way and looking another way. Altogether, that's Erik the Red and Leif Eriksson, Norse explorers. Next, we have Vladimir I of Kiev. Kiev is the most populated city of the Ukraine, and it's also its capital city. But of course, hundreds of years ago, that territory wasn't known as the Ukraine. So just be aware that we're talking about a vaguely Polish, Hungarian, Ukrainian, somewhat Russian region of the world. Vladimir I began as sort of a pagan bad boy king. He had over 800 concubines, and more wives on top of that. Everywhere he went, he built pagan temples. Any god who he thought would appeal to the people around him and get him the most political clout, then that was the temple he built. At one point, several people had come to him from different religions. In response, he sent many of his advisors out to explore the cities of all of these different faiths. The only one that impressed him was Constantinople. They were very impressed. One of them wrote back to Vladimir, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. We only know that God dwells there among the people, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations." So this is a major argument for having our worship time be as beautiful as possible, because it definitely worked on Vladimir I. These advisors came back, and Vladimir then rejected all the religions he'd heard about. He didn't reject Christianity. He said, "I'm not rejecting it," but he also didn't convert. That is, until he meets Anna, the beautiful sister of Emperor Basil II. At the time, none of the daughters of the emperors had ever been married to barbarian Russian, Ukrainian, Hungarian, Polish guys. But Vladimir was persuasive. He was baptized on the spot and then married to Anna. He came back to Kiev a changed man. He destroyed the pagan temples he had built and commissioned Christian churches. He was known throughout the rest of his life as someone who would distribute food and drink to the poor and needy, who would go visit other people who were too unwell to visit him. He abolished capital punishment. You could no longer have your life taken away for committing a crime. He abolished torture and mutilation at the hands of the court. He really tried to live out his faith, and because of that, he lived at peace with many of the territories around him. In fact, in Slavic history, he's not called Vladimir I. He's called Vladimir the Great. To create the sign, we're going to give our Vladimir. Too bad we've had a lot of peace signs, but okay, Vladimir, and then we'll flip our hands around to do a first. Vladimir the First. And then we're going to give a K for Kiev or Kiev. And that one it's sort of two fingers with a thumb in between, kind of cocked at an angle. So it'll be Vladimir the First of Kiev. Next we have Byzantine Emperor Basil II. Hey, we just heard about him. Basil II, or Basil II, was the Byzantine emperor for 49 years and 11 months. His was the longest reign of any emperor. And it was a reign marked by intrigues and murders and poisonings. His own father died when he was still a child. He and his brother were crowned emperor, but then of course someone else had to run the empire while they were still too young to rule. People were poisoned or suspected of having been poisoned. People were murdered. No. People were murdered, or at least we suspect that they were murdered. A lot happened, and he didn't trust very many people. The one thing he most wanted was to regain the empire. He wanted to expand the Byzantine Empire to be what it once was, and he was very successful. After he dealt with tons of wars with... Oh my god. Hi. Come here, you. First, he had to deal with tons of strife and revolts happening between his own people. Many of the aristocrats in his own empire and the generals in his own empire marched against him and tried to get territory away from him. He had to deal with all of that civil unrest first before he could begin to expand the empire. When he did expand, the most famous place he expanded into was Bulgaria. This was a massive military campaign. It lasted a long time, and there were many deaths. Even today, he is revered in Byzantine history, and the Bulgarians hate him. In fact, his nickname is the Bulgar Slayer. That's not a good nickname. And he really did slay them. Have you ever heard of the Bulgarian Empire? No? It's because he destroyed it. He called all of this expansion and all of his territory combined the New Rome. One of his big power moves in expanding this empire is that he was willing to marry off his sister Anna, who was unwilling, by the way, to Vladimir I of Kiev, or Kiev. In exchange, Vladimir I gave him 16,000 soldiers, and these soldiers fought many campaigns for him, won many campaigns for him, and eventually they became the Varangian Guard. He was what's known as a porphyrogenitos, which means he was born into the purple. He was of royal blood, he was from the royal family, he was always going to be something important, like an emperor. In some ways, he wasn't a very popular guy. He sort of rejected Greek culture, Greek philosophy, even Greek clothing and language. They said he was more Roman than Greek, even though this was the Byzantine Empire, where you would expect things to be more Greek. He never seemed to fit in. He was described as being kind of ugly and coarse and rude. All of his life was spent in intrigue and campaigning. In fact, he marched with his soldiers instead of just sending them orders from Constantinople. He marched with them and ate the same rations that his soldiers ate. He also cared for the children of fallen soldiers. So his soldiers loved him. His farmers loved him because he lowered their taxes. But a lot of other people found him unappealing. He never married. He had no heirs. One historian described him as the loneliest emperor. Also not a good nickname. He was facing so much strife that he was told, "Cut down the governors who become overproud. Let no generals on campaign have too many resources. Exhaust them with unjust actions to keep them busied with their own affairs. Admit no woman to the imperial councils. Be accessible to no one. Share with few your most intimate plans." No wonder he was lonely. Lonely as he may have been, Basil II was incredibly successful at his primary goal, which was expanding that empire. When he died, it was during a siege. No one really knows what happened to him. They found his body in a church, propped up with a shepherd's flute in his mouth. These are the words that he had placed on his tomb. "From the day that the King of Heaven called upon me to become the emperor, the great overlord of the world, no one saw my spear lie idle. I stayed alert throughout my life and protected the children of New Rome, valiantly campaigning both in the west and in the outposts of the east. O man, seeing now my tomb here, reward me for my campaigns with your prayers." To create this sign, we'll first do a B for Byzantine. Byzantine. Then take that hand without even really changing what you're doing and just kind of grab from one side of your body to the other to create that sash of the emperor. So it's Byzantine emperor and then flip that B back. That's why I kind of keep my thumb in position so that I can flip in and out of it really quickly. Byzantine emperor Basil II. We'll flip our hands backward. So all together, Byzantine emperor Basil II. Next, we have 1000 AD. Since there isn't time in the music to get through 1000 AD, let's just do 1000 AD, 1000 AD. It is so fast. Our last timeline card this week is the East-West Schism of the Church. This is also known as the Schism of 1054 or just the Great Schism. I'll admit to not understanding all the ins and outs of what led to the final breakdown, but basically what happened is that just like when Rome was breaking apart and we were getting the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, for a long time everybody still just said, we're all Rome, we're all Rome. We're just starting to have two completely different cultures in two completely different geographical locations with two completely different leaders and laws and preferences. They still said they were all Rome till they weren't. The same thing happened in the Christian church. For a long time, we had Western Christianity and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it was just sort of different flavors of Christianity that coexisted. But they had different locations, different leaders, different laws, different cultural preferences. Until eventually it was just too much, too many differences. On the surface, it looks as if the church broke over nothing. It was an argument over whether or not we could use unleavened bread in communion. But of course, under the surface, this was really about everything. Geography, leadership, culture, language, clothing, history, and understanding of theology and Christianity. These two sides, these two neighborhoods of Christianity have been very separate for a long time. But this schism made it official. It was documented. They were officially two separate churches, each under their own authority, and each claiming to be under the authority of God. The motions for this one are really easy. We're going to do east, west, and then schism, and just pull them apart. East, west, schism, and then I like to add a little prayer sign here, church. So we'll have east, west, schism of the church. Easy. Ready to see it all put together? 3, 2, 1, go!
Japan's imperial. Charlemagne, crowned emperor of Europe. Alfred the Great of England. Erik the Red and Leif Eriksson, Norse explorer. Vladimir I of Kiev, Byzantine emperor Basil II. 1080, 1080. East-West schism of the church. Norman conquest and feudalism in Europe.
Okay, here we go.
Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, this is my timeline. Timeline, timeline. We'll start at the beginning of the ages. Age of ancient empires. Creation to circa 450 AD. Creation and the fall. The flood and the Tower of Babel. Mesopotamia and Sumer Egyptians. 3000 BC, 3000 BC. Indus River Valley civilization, Minoans and
Mycenaeans.
7 wonders of the ancient world. Patriarchs of Israel. 2000 BC, 2000 BC. Hittites and Canaanites, Kush, Assyrians, Babylonians, China, Shang Dynasty, Hinduism in India, Phoenicians and the alphabet, Olmecs of Mesoamerica, Israelite exodus and desert wandering, Israelite conquest and judges, Greek dark ages, Israel's United Kingdom. 1000 BC, 1000 BC, early Native Americans. Israel divides into 2 kingdoms, Homer and Hesiod. Rome founded by Romulus and Remus. Israel falls to Assyria. Assyria falls to Babylon. Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha. Judah falls to Babylon. Temple destroyed. Babylon falls to Persia. Jews return and rebuild the temple. Roman Republic, Golden Age of Greece, Peloponnesian Wars. Persia falls to Alexander the Great. India's Mauryan Empire, Mayans of Mesoamerica, Punic Wars, Rome conquers Greece. Roman dictator Julius Caesar,
Caesar Augustus and the Pax Romana.
John the Baptist, Jesus the Messiah. Year 180, year 180, year 180. Pentecost and the early church. Persecution spread the gospel. Herod's temple destroyed by Titus. Diocletian divides the Roman Empire. Constantine legalizes Christianity. India's Gupta dynasty. Council of Nicaea, Augustine of Hippo. Jerome completes the Vulgate. Visigoths at Rome. The Middle Ages, circa 450 to circa 1500. Council of Chalcedon, Western Roman Empire falls to barbarians.
500 AD, 500 AD.
Once is enough. Ah!
Byzantine Emperor Justinian.
Benedict and monasticism. Mohammed founds Islam.
Clans in early Ghana in Africa. Franks defeat Muslims at the Battle of Tours.
Golden Age of Islam. Ooh.
Vikings raid and trade. Japan's Heian period.
Charlemagne crowned Emperor of Europe. Alfred the Great of England.
Erik the Red and Leif Eriksson.
Norse explorers. Vladimir I of Kiev.
Byzantine Emperor Basil
II. 1080, 1080. East-West schism of the church. Norman conquest and feudalism in Europe. The Crusades in Zimbabwe and early Mali in Africa. Aztecs of Mesoamerica. Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas. Japan shoguns, Incas of South America. Genghis Khan rules the Mongols. England's Magna Carta. Ottoman Empire. Marco Polo's journey to China. The 100 Years' War and Black Death. The Renaissance. China's Ming Dynasty. Age of exploration, circa 1400 to circa 1600. Prince Henry founds School of Navigation, slave trade in Africa. Gutenberg's printing press, Songhai in Africa. Tsar Ivan the Great of Russia, the Spanish Inquisition. Columbus sails to the Caribbean. 1580, 1580. Age of absolute monarchs.
Circa 1500 to circa 1800.
Protestant Reformation. Spanish conquistadors in the Americas. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. Council of Trent. The Baroque period of the arts. Japan's isolation. Jamestown and Plymouth colony founded. Age of Enlightenment, circa 1650 to circa 1800. Hudson's Bay Company, first great awakening. Classical period of the arts, the 7 Years' War. Age of industry, circa 1760 to circa 1969. James Cook sails to Australia and Antarctica. American Revolution and General George Washington. Madison's Constitution and the Bill of Rights. French Revolution, Second Great Awakening.
Purchase and Lewis and Clark expedition. Napoleon crowned Emperor of France. Liberation of South America. The War of 1812, the Missouri Compromise. Immigrants flock to America. The Monroe Doctrine, romantic period of the arts. Cherokee Trail of Tears, U.S. westward expansion.
March publishes the Communist Manifesto.
The Compromise of 1850 and the Dred Scott Decision. U.S. restores trade with Japan. British Queen Victoria's rule over India. Darwin publishes
The Origin of Species.
Lincoln's War between the states. Reconstruction of the southern states. Dominion of Canada. Otto von Bismarck unifies Germany. Wars in Africa. The Spanish-American War. The Progressive Era. Australia becomes a commonwealth. Mexican Revolution. World War I and President Wilson. Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. U.S. evangelist Billy Graham. Modern period of the arts. The Great Depression and the New Deal. World War II and President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Stalin of the USSR and the Katyn Massacre.
The United Nations formed. The Cold War. Gandhi and India's independence. Jewish state established. Mao and communist victory in China. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Korean War.
Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement.
Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, missionaries to Ecuador, the Antarctic Treaty, the Vietnam War. U.S. astronauts walk on the moon.
On the LNP. Yeah.
Age of information and globalization. Circa 1970 to the present. Watergate, President Nixon resigns.
The best is au revoir.
Fall of communism in Eastern Europe. European Union formed. Apartheid abolished in South Africa. 2000 AD, 2000 AD, September 11th, 2001.
Our fellow citizens are waiting.
Rising tide of freedom, rising tide of freedom.